Hey everybody, Spencer from Geek of Spades here, and today I feel like pissing off a big chunk of the gaming community on the internet by saying positive things about Mantic Games. More specifically, saying positive things about Kings of War. So if you're not familiar with Mantic Games, they're a small company based out of the UK. Allegedly, they're made up of ex-Games Workshop employees. I don't know how true that statement is, but they get a lot of claims of being a cheap knockoff company, which is ironic because A, they're in the same town as Games Workshop, and B, the knockoffs making better products. So yes, Kings of War. Kings of War is Mantic's mass battle fantasy game, and you know, it's good. Admittedly, Kings of War isn't the most in-depth game in the world. It's actually a bit simplistic, and really the strategy isn't quite as deep as I would like, but it's still a solid game. The book is really nice. It's actually really thin. It clocks in at under 200 pages, and it manages to fit in like 6 factions and all the rules, and there's even rules for tournaments and rules for a campaign, which I'll get to later. So yeah, there's a lot going on in this little book, which is amazing considering the size of it, but that's how I like it. I like my books nice and condensed. So at its core, Kings of War is a very similar system to Warhammer Fantasy. In fact, it's basically Warhammer Fantasy with less calories. You have blocks of infantry and they move as a unit and they turn on a wheel and yada 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 yada. Where it differs is that the stat lines are so much more simplified. Instead of having movement and weapon skill and ballistic skill and strength and toughness and a number of attacks and initiative and leadership and armor value, you instead have movement, melee attack, range attack, defense, nerve. You have 5 stats to keep track of, and it's really, really nice. Another thing that differs between this and Warhammer Fantasy is obviously the amount of strategy. Although I feel like Warhammer Fantasy 8th edition got a little too much into too many random elements, like random charges and spells are all random, and it's just so much randomness, which while I enjoy a decent amount of randomness in my games, I also enjoy a decent amount of structure. This takes care of a lot of that. For example, this actually works charges like 7th edition Fantasy did, where it's just double your movement. And I really like that. I don't like the random charges. It doesn't make sense to me, but that's for a whole nother video. The combat rules in this are so much easier to get to because every unit has a melee and ranged attack value, and that tells you what you need to roll on a d6. So once you're in combat, all you have to do is look at the number of attacks you get and then roll that many dice, and you need to roll that many hits on that number. So if you have a unit with 10 attacks and they have a melee of 3 up, you get 10 attacks and you need 3 ups to hit. It's right there. It's simple. There's no charts. There's no tables. There's none of that crap, and I love it. Now, one of the things people really deride Kings of War and Mantic in general for is their miniatures. And admittedly, their miniatures aren't the greatest on the market, but I don't think they're half as bad as people make them out to be. Yeah, their older sculpts you can definitely tell were older, and their newer stuff's getting better and better with every release. Still, I like the design ideas behind a lot of their miniatures. Their elves actually look like warriors. They're wearing armor instead of dresses. Their dwarves don't all look like Gimli clones. And their undead line is just gorgeous. I mean, it's easily the best undead miniatures on the market. And they're cheap. They're affordable. You can get a whole box of 10 cavalry for this game for roughly the same cost of 5 cavalry for Warhammer Fantasy. That's really a great deal, which means Kings of War is a great, cheap alternative. It's an easy game to get into because the rules aren't super complicated, and it's an affordable game to get into if you're looking for that kind of thing. Easily my favorite thing about this game is how building an army is handled. Basically, for every solid unit, which is either 20 or more infantry, or 10 or more cavalry, or 3 or more large-based infantry, you get access to a war machine and a hero or monster. So it really cuts down on the power gaming because you have to take a unit of guys of at least 20 strong before you can even get one hero. Now, I've been saying a lot of nice things about this rule set, and it's because I do like it. But there are some things that just kind of hurt my head. For starters, I don't really like most of the heroes. They don't seem to do much. You can't attach heroes to units, so they're always on their own. And army standards are from what I can tell, at least reading these rules, completely worthless. Because every hero has the inspiring rule, which is what a banner does. So why would you ever pay the 100+ points for an army standard bearer? Especially because you can't attach them to a unit and gain that benefit. But probably my biggest complaint about the rules for this game is nerve. Nerve is like the morale in this game. I like how instead of removing models as they die, you just put wound counters next to the unit, because that means all those models you spent all that time painting don't just become fancy wound markers. However, when it's not your turn, there's nothing to do, because your opponent rolls your nerve scores for you when they inflict damage on your unit. And I hate that. It's so dumb. I mean, you want to feel involved in the game, but if your opponent's taking their turn, you might as well go out and get lunch. Now, I mentioned there's a campaign in this, and I love that. I'm a huge fan of campaigns. However, there is one big flaw with the campaign system. When you get experience, you save that up, and when a unit gets a certain amount of experience, they gain the elite rule. Unfortunately, elves already have that rule, which means playing elves in a campaign, you get absolutely nothing. Now, there are a couple of other minor things here and there that kind of irk me. The magic system in the core book isn't super deep. However, if you have the Basilian Legacy book, which has a couple new armies, only one of which is really all that impressive, it does have a little bit more focus on the magic. It kind of expands it, but needing a whole second book just to make the magic system work a little bit better is kind of a dick move. Now, if I had to suggest between Kings of War, Warhammer Fantasy, or something like War Gods of Egyptus, like if you're looking for that style of game, I would have to say War Gods. It's probably the best system of the three, and it's probably the most solid in terms of just being well written and having a good line of miniatures. Kings of War comes in a very close second, though, and if I had to say between Kings of War and Warhammer Fantasy at this point, I would say Kings of War. It's a good game, it's balanced well, and overall, it's just solid. There's complaints, obviously. I mean, no game's perfect, but yeah, it's a good game. It's not the best army scale game, and it's definitely the most simplistic of the army scale games, but it's serviceable and it's fun. So yeah, I would suggest Kings of War if you're looking into this style of game and you don't already play Warhammer Fantasy. It's a good setting, it's a solid set of rules, and the book is nice and affordable. So if you're looking for an army-scaled fantasy game with elves and dwarves and all that good stuff, I do suggest checking out Kings of War.